There are voids so old that even the stars have forgotten their names, gulfs of unlit existence where reality thins and the laws of form unravel into screaming color. Within such a place, deeper than the lightless tides of real space, a coffin drifted, blackened iron, etched with sigils that had never been carved by human hands. It moved without momentum, without guidance, carried by currents that were not water, but memory, madness, and hatred. The warp howled around it, a cathedral of impossible sound, filled with whispers that clawed at the edges of thought. Inside the coffin, something smiled. He had dreamed of battlefields, dreamed of ruined cities that bled into the horizon, dreamed of rivers of blood so vast they reflected skies that did not exist. But these were not dreams born of fantasy. They were memories of other hunts, other wars, other legends that ended in silence and ash. Now the silence cracked. The coffin trembled, not from impact, not from force, but from proximity. The warp noticed him. A million demonic eyes turned. Shapes coalesced from raw emotion, horned silhouettes, winged mockeries of angels, crawling masses of mouths and claws. They circled the coffin like predators who had found something that did not obey the scent of fear. Normally, mortal souls screamed here. They dissolved, became screams themselves. They were unmade, scattered, devoured. But the thing inside the coffin did not scream. His eyes opened inside the darkness, red, ancient, amused. The inside of the coffin was narrow, suffocating. But he had slept in deeper graves. His lips slowly curved, not in warmth, not in humor, but in recognition. "Ah," he murmured to the void, voice like silk dragged across bone. "This is new." The demons pressed closer, their forms melting in and out of coherence. One reached a claw made of broken prayers toward the coffin lid. Its touch did not scrape metal. It screamed as its arm dissolved into nothing. The coffin drank. The lid burst outward, not with force, but with inevitability. Darkness poured from within like liquid night, spreading across the impossible void. From this crawling shadow rose a figure draped in a long red coat, boots touching nothing, hair flowing as if underwater. His presence did not disturb the warp, it wounded it. Alucard stretched, bones cracking softly, as if waking from a long, satisfying rest. He inhaled, and the air tasted of madness, old hatred, betrayal layered upon betrayal. It was not unpleasant. "This world," he said, voice echoing inside a dimension that had never known echo. "Smells entertaining." The first demon lunged. It was vast. A towering mass of muscle grown from rage, crowned with a skull of black iron. A creature of endless battle, built only to kill and to glorify slaughter. Its axe was a crescent of coagulated blood. It screamed a name that had never been spoken in reality. Alucard did not move. The axe passed through him. The demon froze, confused. Its eyes, or the places where eyes should have been, flickered. It tried to pull back its weapon. It was too late. Black tendrils burst from Alucard's shadow, wrapping around the demon's torso, piercing it, drinking it. The creature's roar became a gurgle, then a whimper, then a silence eaten alive. Its existence collapsed inward, vanishing not into death, but into him. Alucard exhaled slowly, savoring. The warp shuddered. More shapes gathered. They did not charge. They observed. They whispered to one another in languages made of broken promises. "This realm is loud," Alucard continued, floating forward, the coffin crumbling behind him into nothing. "And yet, no master of ceremony greets me, no king, no god brave enough to say hello." The warp answered with a distant, thunderous laugh. Far away, beyond layers of raw unreality, something vast stirred upon a throne of skulls. On a garden of rotting perfection, a great swollen consciousness turned its attention. In palaces of silk and sin, a presence paused mid-indulgence. And in a tower of impossible angles, a being of pure manipulation opened countless metaphorical eyes at once. They felt him, and for the first time in a very long eternity, they felt uncertainty. Alucard drifted onward, passing through fields of screaming souls trapped in amber-like thought, through storms of living colour that tried and failed to erode him. He reached the edge of the Imperium, where reality thickened, where the thin membrane of the material world pressed back against madness. He saw it then, a galaxy, not a gentle scatter of stars, not a quiet, sleeping spiral of light. This galaxy was a wound. It burned. It flickered with war. Entire sectors glowed with the fire of extermination. Massive cathedrals floated through space, built upon the bones of planets and the corpses of dead civilizations. Fleets of warships carved through void like funeral processions of iron. And at the center of it all, a psychic scream, constant, endless, agonized, coming from a throne that should never have existed. Alucard's smile deepened. A world built on suffering, he whispered, tasting the idea in his mind. A universe that worships a corpse and fears its own shadow. The warp twisted behind him. Something was coming. Something old had noticed that something older had arrived. The barrier between madness and reality thinned, and the coffin maker stepped forward, preparing to fall into a world that had no idea what hunted it. As he crossed the threshold, the warp screamed in warning or in terror, and the question echoed unspoken through the immaterial depths, unanswered and unanswerable. What had truly entered this galaxy of eternal war? He fell without falling. The transition from the warp to reality was not a passage through space, but a violation of law. The Imperium peeled away like wet parchment, and cold, dead physics clawed their way back into existence. Alucard did not burn in the friction. He did not scream. He arrived. The sky was iron. It hung above a world of ash, a ceiling of low, roiling clouds stained yellow by distant fires. There was no sun visible, only a dim, sickly glow that leaked through the choking atmosphere like light through a corpse's eyelids. The ground beneath his boots cracked and sighed, a desert of bone dust and blackened stone. Every step pressed centuries of dead into silent powder. This was a grave world, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply used up. He inhaled. The air was thick with the stench of machine oil, burned flesh, old incense, and something older still, hopelessness. It lingered in every drifting mote of ash, in every twisted skeleton half buried in the soil. This planet had not died. It had been bled. Far in the distance, colossal structures pierced the horizon. Cathedrals scaled beyond reason, their spires jagged like broken spears thrust toward an uncaring heaven. Gargoyles the size of battle tanks clung to their edges, frozen in eternal screams. Between these monuments of decay crawled the wreckage of war machines, rusted and abandoned, half swallowed by the dust of forgotten campaigns. Alucard walked forward, his boots the only sound in a world that had forgotten quiet. He felt eyes upon him long before he saw their source. Hidden Auspex sensors flickered awake in buried bunkers. Ancient machine spirits, half mad from centuries of isolation, stirred in their rusted housings. Far below the surface, cables hummed for the first time in decades, carrying fragmented reports to systems that no longer remembered how to listen. Unidentified entity, no radiation profile, No psychic signature, no soul. That last absence disturbed them most. He came upon the remains of a battlefield. Broken lasguns lay scattered like children's toys. Helmets cracked open, still containing fragments of bone fused to the interior. Banners, half buried in ash, fluttered weakly in a wind that tasted of old smoke. The ground was pockmarked with craters, each one a frozen scream of violence. This was not war as he had known it. This was industry, mass-produced death, standardized suffering, ritualized extermination. Alucard knelt beside a corpse. It had once been human. The armor was crude, bulky, marked with Aquila symbols and purity seals. Scraps of parchment covered in cramped prayers and sealed with blackened wax. The face beneath the shattered visor was hollow, eyes wide, mouth locked open in a soundless final cry. He placed 2 fingers gently upon the corpse's neck. There was no blood left to taste, only echoes. Their lives had not been spent. They had been spent cheaply. He rose slowly. Somewhere in the distant ruins, a massive bell tolled. Its sound rolled across the dead plains, deep and resonant, vibrating through bone and stone. It was not a call to prayer. It was a warning. The air shimmered faintly as hidden servitors rose from their burial pits, their mechanical limbs whining in protest. Most were broken. Their flesh had rotted away long ago, leaving only skeletal frames of metal and rust. Their optical lenses flickered weakly, trying to process what stood before them. Target classification impossible. Threat assessment inconclusive. Purge protocol uncertain. They raised their weapons anyway. Thin beams of red light lashed toward him, hot, angry, desperate. The first struck his chest and dispersed like mist. The second burned away a strip of cloth from his coat. The third passed through his skull, emerging from the other side without resistance. Alucard did not stop walking. One by one, the servitors failed. Not from violence, but from proximity. Their machine spirits shrieked silently, their logic engines overwhelmed by the presence of something that existed outside all known templates of reality. They collapsed in a heap of metal and bone. He continued toward the cathedrals. With each step, he felt the weight of something awful pressing down from above, a psychic pressure that had nothing to do with him. It felt like a massive, broken mind screaming without end. A presence chained, tortured, worshipped. He could taste it now. The corpse emperor. Not a god. Not a man. A wound nailed to a throne. Millions of souls burned every day to keep that scream alive, to maintain a prison of flesh and wire around a being that could no longer die, could no longer live. Alucard laughed softly, the sound thin in the poisoned air. A throne of agony, he whispered to no one. A galaxy nailed to a dead king's suffering. Something moved atop one of the distant towers, a silhouette against the toxic clouds. Armored, immense, crowned with ecclesiastical symbols, and dragging a massive weapon that hummed with machine spirit wrath. It was not alone. Others gathered, their forms barely visible through the choking haze. They had seen him. They did not know what he was, but they knew he did not belong. Alucard's eyes flared brighter in the ashen gloom. At last, a world that would not look away. The bell tolled again, louder, more insistent, echoing across the broken plains as ancient defenses began their slow, grinding awakening. In the distant cathedrals, forgotten reactors sparked back to foul life. Targeting arrays aligned. Machine spirits howled their litanies of war. And through it all, a single unspoken question drifted through the dead air, carried by the wind of old ashes. Had this galaxy just found its doom, or something far worse? The first hymn reached him before the first bolt. It rolled across the dead plains like a wave of fire carried on human breath, a chorus of women's voices raised not in hope, but in obedience. The words were high Gothic, old and heavy, layered with centuries of ritual. Each syllable tasted of incense and ash, faith weaponized, devotion sharpened into a blade. Alucard turned as the first transport broke through the low clouds. It was a black chapel turned into a war machine. Its hull was plated in cathedral stone and adamantium, its wings shaped like massive gilded reliquaries. Stained glass viewports glowed faintly from within, illuminated by candlelight rather than tactical displays. Purity seals fluttered from its sides like the flayed skins of saints snapping in the hot wind. It landed with a sound like a tomb being sealed. Ramps descended. They marched out in perfect formation. Women clad in black ceramite armor, etched with fleur-de-lis and the iconography of the ecclesiarchy. Their helms were shaped like the faces of martyred angels, frozen forever in righteous anguish. Each bore a bolter held close to the chest, as if it were a sacred text rather than a weapon. Incense burners hung from their belts, filling the air with thick, oily smoke that smelled of burned myrrh and dried blood. The Adepta Sororitas had arrived. Their leader stepped forward, her armor more ornate, her shoulder pauldrons crowned with miniature cathedrals. A power sword rested at her side, its blade humming with restrained fury. Through her helm's grille, her voice emerged amplified and reverent. "Unidentified entity," she intoned, each word part of a ritual older than most stars. "You stand upon a world sanctified by war and sealed by martyrdom, by the throne and by the blood of the Emperor. Identify yourself." Alucard looked at them. He saw no fear, no doubt, no flicker of hesitation, only perfect, hollow devotion. "I have had many names," he replied softly. His voice carried without effort, curling through the thick air and brushed with a faint velvet darkness. Most of them were spoken by victims. The sororitas did not react. They aimed. Bolters roared. The sound was not a simple crack of gunfire. It was thunder wrapped in hate. Each mass reactive round screamed as it flew, small warheads trailing heat distortions. The air filled with the smell of burned propellant and scorched metal. Impacts tore the dust apart, explosions blossoming like obscene flowers where the shells struck. Most passed through him. Those that hit burst against an absence. Fragments of his coat drifted like dying crows through the smoke. His body twisted, blurred, unraveled, then rewove itself like smoke remembering its shape. He walked forward as the storm of fire intensified. The hymns grew louder. The sisters sang of purity bought with blood, of sin scoured by flame, of a galaxy balanced upon the shoulders of the faithful. Their voices did not waver as they watched their rounds fail. The possibility of failure had already been burned out of them long ago. A heavy bolter barked from the rear lines, its rounds carving furrows in the ash as they flew. One struck Alucard in the shoulder. The impact detonated inside him. His flesh opened like a crimson flower. He felt it. Pain, sharp and immediate. A novelty, a courtesy. He smiled wider. In the blink of an eye, he was among them. Shadows flared outward from his form, spearing through armor joints, coiling around limbs, slipping through visors as black, liquid malice. A sister's bolter misfired, jamming with a shriek of tortured metal. Another's eyes widened behind her lenses as she felt something cold and ancient wrap itself around her soul, tasting at the edges. Still, they did not break. A sister of battle ignited her flamer, drenching the air in holy fire. The flames tasted of sacred oils and consecrated promethium, burning hotter than normal war fuel. They closed around Alucard, turning his form into a silhouette of living night inside a roaring golden furnace. He walked through it. The fire parted around him. He reached the leader. They stood less than a meter apart, two impossibilities facing one another. Faith so absolute it bordered insanity, and existence so wrong it mocked the laws of God and nature alike. Witch, she spat. Monster. Blasphemy made flesh. Her power sword ignited. Blue-white energy crawled along its length, humming with destructive potential. She swung. He caught the blade with 2 fingers. The energy discharged into him. The ground cracked. The air screamed. Around them, the sororitas froze, watching their commander lock hands with a being that should not stand. Alucard leaned closer, so close that she could smell old blood and colder darkness beneath his human guise. "Your god is screaming," he told her softly. "Do you hear him? Or have they trained you to call that sound faith?" Her eyes widened, not in fear, in violent, absolute rage. She wrenched the blade free and drove it forward, straight through his chest. The energy detonated inside him, lighting his ribs with ghostly light. Alucard looked down at the wound, then back at her. "My turn," he whispered. Behind her, the ash storm thickened. The sky darkened further, and somewhere, far above the iron clouds, ancient systems locked onto the battlefield as larger guns began to awaken. As the sisters raised their weapons again, and the first signs of orbital attention turned toward the world, one question hovered in the burning air, unspoken but alive in every soul present. Had they just met a heretic, or unleashed something their emperor himself would not dare face? The shells began to fall before the sisters could pull their triggers again. The sky split open with distant thunder, not from weather, but from ships that treated planets as targets and prayer beads as targeting codes. Trails of burning light tore through the iron clouds, descending in shrieking arcs. The first impact struck kilometers away, but the shockwave rolled across the plain like a continental gasp, lifting ash and bone into a towering, choking veil. The sororitas did not retreat. They knelt. In unison, they pressed clenched fists to their breastplates and began to chant louder, their voices cracking through the rising howl of orbital bombardment. To them, annihilation was not a fate to avoid. It was a sacrament to be earned. Alucard stepped away from the impaled blade in his chest. The wound closed with a wet, intimate sound, flesh knitting as though time itself respected him enough to reverse an insult. He watched another pillar of fire descend from the heavens, the ground shattering, skulls vaporizing, ancient dust turning to glass beneath the intense heat. He felt it, the violence, not as chaos, as abundance. This galaxy was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse on a galactic scale, running endlessly, efficiently, devoutly. Every explosion was a prayer, every corpse a tithe. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the fractured earth, writhing, twisting, as if it were tasting the air. The sisters rose again, raising their bolters toward him, but a new sound tore through the hymn. A deeper roar, mechanical, ancient, wrathful. From beyond the cathedral ruins came the grinding step of something larger. The ground shook with each footfall, rhythmic as a funeral drum. A penitent engine emerged from the dust, a towering, skeletal frame of iron and pistons towering over the sisters like a walking execution altar. At its center, a human figure was bolted and chained, arms spread wide in eternal crucifixion. Exposed flesh was flayed and grafted directly into the machine's control systems. Electrodes pulsed in their spine. Needles drove stims and sacred pain into their veins. Their eyes were gone. Their mouth was a machine filter of constant, agonized prayer. The engine roared, and the sound was not mechanical. It was human. Alucard tilted his head. "Oh," he murmured, "you wrap your monsters in saints." The penitent engine charged. Its massive eviscerator blades spun to life, teeth screaming as they bit into the air. It moved with terrifying speed, driven not by logic, but by chemically induced fanaticism. The sisters parted before it, forming a perfect avenue of death. The first blade swept through Alucard's torso. His body split apart in a shower of crimson mist. For a fraction of a second, the machine believed it had succeeded. Then the mist laughed. He reformed behind it, hands resting lightly on the iron spine of the engine. The human within felt this touch immediately, not as pain, but as recognition. "Do you enjoy this?" Alucard asked softly into the howling machinery. "Does your emperor hear you through the wires?" The response was a strangled hymn, filtered through blood and steel. The engine slammed backward, trying to crush him against the ground. He did not move. The pistons strained. The frame screamed, as if aware that it was being humiliated. Alucard's shadow flowed forward, seeping into joints, wrapping around rotating blades, crawling into exposed cables. The machine began to choke. Sparks flew. The human inside screamed loud enough to break the hymn. Then the engine collapsed, folding inward, crushed by something that did not need strength. Silence fell over the battlefield for less than a heartbeat. Then came the heretics. They poured from the broken ruins like a malignant tide. Twisted men and women wearing armor defaced with 8-pointed stars, their flesh branded with blasphemous runes. Chains hung from their bodies. Hooks pierced their skin. Their weapons were crude but heavy and stained with old dried blood. They had been hiding beneath the ruins, waiting for a moment of weakness. They saw him. They saw the sisters. They did not care who won. They only cared for slaughter. Bolter fire erupted again, this time from both sides, red beams and mass reactive rounds filling the air with heat and screaming metal. Promethium washed over the ground as flamers roared. The smell of burning flesh, machine oil, and sanctified incense blended into something thick enough to taste. Alucard walked into it all. Each heretic he touched collapsed inward, their bodies emptied like skins torn free of their contents. Every drop of blood rushed toward him, swirling like a storm, feeding into the shadow that clustered around his form. He felt stronger, not nourished, entertained. A chainsword bit deep into his side. He allowed it. The teeth chewed and screamed, sparks spraying as they drank his flesh. He leaned down to the wide-eyed heretic holding it. "You call this chaos?" he asked gently, before tearing the man's head from his shoulders with one hand. Above them, the clouds began to part, not by nature, by technology. A battle barge's shadow passed over the land, blotting out the already dying light. Targeting lasers lanced down, painting the ground in thin, red lines that trembled faintly with murderous promise. Alucard looked up into the darkened heavens. There were more of them. Dozens. Hundreds. A galaxy above him that solved all its questions with fire and extinction. And deep within him, something shifted. Not hunger. Recognition. This was a world that could feed something far more dangerous than hunger. As the first macro cannon shells began to fall, and the sisters raised their voices once more in defiant prayer, a quiet, terrible thought passed through the immortal's mind. If this galaxy was built on endless war, How long would it survive once it realized war had found its master? The bombardment ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The sky remained bruised and heavy, but the falling fire stopped, leaving only drifting ash and the distant groan of overworked machine spirits. Silence returned to the battlefield, thick and unnatural, as if even the galaxy had inhaled and held its breath. It was not mercy, it was assessment. Far above, within a black cathedral-shaped voidship, a man watched the world through layers of reinforced glass and sensorium arrays. His face was thin, pale, carved with lines that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with knowledge. A bronze rosette hung from his collar, cold against his skin. Inquisitor Malrek of the Ordo Malleus did not blink. The pick feed flickered, filtering through static and warp-scarred interference. He watched the lone figure standing amid shattered sisters, broken heretics, and a collapsed penitent engine. He watched the way the air warped around him, the way Auspex could not agree on his temperature, his mass, his existence. No soul detected, no warp signature, no classification. Impossible. Weapons ineffective, murmured a servitor at his side, its voice a monotone rasp filtered through broken vocal cords. Orbital strike efficiency, inconclusive. Malrek leaned closer to the glass. He is not inconclusive, he said softly. He is heresy with a sense of humor. A second voice arose from the shadows, female, calm, disciplined. Shall we purge? The Inquisitor considered. He did not answer immediately. He watched as, on the surface far below, Alucard tilted his head toward the sky, as if he could feel the gaze that weighed upon him. The corner of the Immortal's mouth twitched. He knows, Malrek whispered. On the surface, Alucard felt the shift. Not guns, not rage, attention. Something precise had turned its eye upon him. He could taste it, faintly metallic, threaded with psychic cold. Not a god, not a demon, a man. He stepped into a lingering fog of ash and heat, walking beyond the fallen sisters and torn heretics, moving toward the broken cathedral ruins. Each step took him deeper into a world that smelled of rot and reverence. The ruins were older than the Imperium's current memory. Stone blackened by centuries of war loomed high above him. Carved saints stared down with eroded faces, their eyes worn smooth by time and endless ash storms. Within the broken walls, something waited. Hidden sigils flared faintly along the cracked stone. Wards etched in blood and sanctified with prayer awakened. Thin lines of golden light crisscrossed the air around him, forming complex cages woven from scripture and psychic will. He felt them touch him. They died. The light flickered, stuttered, collapsed into harmless sparks. From the shadows, men emerged. They wore no heraldry, no grand armor. Their clothing was black, practical, layered with hidden sigils and blessing stitches only visible under certain light. Their eyes were hard, calculating, knowing. Stormtroopers of the Inquisition. Hotshot lasguns raised in perfect synchrony. At their center walked the woman from the voidship, her steps measured, her presence controlled. Her armor was lighter, adaptive, etched with a single sigil, the stylized letter I crowned by a skull. Entity, she said. Her voice carried no fear, only purpose. You are in violation of existence. Alucard's smile returned, slow and courteous. That accusation, he replied, has followed me for centuries. Her finger twitched. The shots were not normal las bolts. They were wrapped in hexagrammic wards burning with latent psychic light. They struck him like fragments of a dying star, tearing through his coat, ripping through flesh, burning deeper than flame. He did not fall, but he felt it, not pain, constraint. The air thickened. Invisible chains of force wrapped around him, reinforced by spoken liturgies and whispered exorcisms. The stormtroopers began to chant, voices low, precise, layered over ancient rites designed to bind demons and cage warp entities. He laughed. The sound was low, resonant, intimate. "You think I am of your abyss?" he asked, and the shadows beneath his feet expanded like spilled ink. "Your monsters crawl out of madness. I crawl out of silence." The ground cracked beneath one of the stormtroopers, and his own shadow dragged him screaming into the floor, consuming him without splash or sound. The others opened fire again, but the shots bent away, curving mid-air as if reality had briefly lost interest. The woman stepped back a single pace. She activated a device on her wrist. Somewhere far above, Malrek felt the signal. "Begin phase 2, she said. A low, thrumming vibration filled the air. The ruined cathedral began to glow from within. Hidden beneath its stones were ancient containment pylons, relics of the Great Crusade, turned from their original purpose into a trap. A cage built not of metal, but of belief and psychic denial. Reality stiffened. The air felt heavier. Even the ash seemed reluctant to drift. Alucard lifted his hand slightly, testing the air like touching water. For the first time, the world resisted him. Not enough to stop him, enough to interest him. Above, within the void ship, Inquisitor Malrek leaned forward, eyes gleaming faintly in the half-light. "It bleeds," he whispered, watching the faint flicker along Alucard's form. Not blood, not warp, something else. On the surface, the woman raised her weapon again, but did not fire. Her voice when she spoke was quieter. "We do not need to kill you," she said. "We only need to understand what you are." Alucard's eyes drifted upward, past the ruined arches, past the choking clouds, toward the distant, unseen ship. "Then come closer," he replied, "and let me understand what hunts me." The trap tightened, wards brightening, machine spirits howling as they strained to contain something they could not name. And across the ruin, buried deep within ancient stone and older fear, a single thought echoed through both hunter and hunted. When the thing you chase finally turns around, will you still believe you are the predator? The trap did not close all at once. It tightened slowly, deliberately, like a patient hand curling around a fragile throat. The cathedral's buried pylons burned brighter beneath the cracked stone, their ancient machine spirits screaming in binary terror as they attempted to impose order upon something that had never belonged to order. Hexagrammic wards crawled through the air, folding into lattices of denial, scripture, and forced reality. Alucard stood within it all, unmoving. He felt the pressure, but it did not frighten him. It intrigued him. The air thickened around his skin, giving resistance to the space normally occupied by nothing. For the first time since his arrival, the world insisted upon him being in one place. He stretched his fingers slightly. The space resisted. He laughed softly. In the void ship above, Inquisitor Malrek leaned back from the glass. His gaunt fingers rested clasped before his lips as runic telemetry scrolled endlessly across hololithic displays. Auspex readings flickered without consistency. Psychic sensors showed nothing, then surged, then collapsed into impossible negatives. "It is not of the warp," he murmured to himself. And yet, beside him a robed psyker began to tremble. "No," the psyker whispered, blood trickling from their nose. "It is calling it, without meaning to." The first ripple passed through the Imperium like a bruise spreading under translucent flesh. Far from the dying world, Where the warp coiled in on itself in endless hurricanes of thought and nightmare, something shifted, a subtle deviation in currents that had flowed unchanged for millennia. A momentary hesitation in omnipresent madness. The warp whispered to itself, "Something is wrong." Within the storm of unreality, lesser demons recoiled as if stung. A flock of screaming horrors scattered into bursts of multicolored flame. In a churning sea of blood and rusted iron, a massive presence paused mid-slaughter and turned its ancient attention toward a new, unfamiliar pressure. The laugh was distant, but it was real. On the surface, the Inquisition's stormtroopers began to feel it. Some faltered, not from fear, but from a sensation deeper than training. The air no longer felt like air. The ground stopped feeling like stone. Reality itself felt thin, as though stretched across an abyss that had not existed moments before. The woman leading them felt it most keenly. Her training screamed for withdrawal. Her faith screamed for purge. Her instincts, honed by years of hunting witches and abominations, whispered a truth she did not want to speak. This thing was not breaking their laws. It was ignoring them. "Hold formation," she said, forcing control into her voice. "Increase chant frequency. Reinforce the cage." The troopers obeyed instantly. Their voices rose faster, sharper. Words meant to flay demons poured from their throats. Names of forbidden things spat with calculated malice. Promises of annihilation made in a dozen dead languages. The cage tightened, and for the first time, Alucard's coat fluttered not from wind, but from pressure. He felt another presence, not the Inquisition, not the Imperium. Something vast, something watching. The air behind him darkened without consuming light. It folded inward, as if a hole had been sliced into reality and filled with breathing shadow. Faces formed and unformed within it, screaming prayers backwards, whispering war cries in languages older than bones. A demon silhouette dragged itself halfway into being. Not summoned, not invited, curious. His voice crawled from everywhere at once, layered with hunger and confusion. "You are not ours." Alucard turned slowly. The thing recoiled slightly under his gaze. "But you have touched the storm," it continued, "and the storm is aware." The cage flared again, as the troopers redoubled their chanting. The inquisitorial psi-tech howled, trying to reject what it could not classify. Reality buckled slightly around the intruding warp presence, forcing it to struggle against a membrane of faith and denial. Alucard stepped closer to it. The demon's form became clearer, a tall shape woven of coiling smoke, chains, and half-formed mouths. Its eyes, if they could be called that, flickered with infant fear. "Tell them," Alucard said softly. "Tell your masters what you felt." The creature shuddered. "They are watching now," it whispered. "The red one stirs. The rotting one turns his gaze. The one of lies has begun to smile." It dragged itself backward, retreating into nothing, forced out not by violence, but by proximity. Then it was gone. The air sealed. The warp's whisper faded, but not completely. In the void ship, the psyker collapsed, screaming, hands clutching their skull. "They see him," they gasped. "They were not looking before. Now, they are looking." Malrek's eyes hardened. On the surface, the woman felt the change. The cage still held. The target still stood. But now something else moved behind the veil. Something older than her order. Older than her faith. She tightened her grip on her weapon. "Report," she demanded. One of the stormtroopers answered without turning his head. "Sensors show anomalous warp agitation beyond local parameters." She understood immediately. The warp had noticed. She looked back at Alucard, who stood calmly within the shimmering prison of light and scripture, his red eyes burning brighter in the rising gloom. He met her gaze. "That was your trap," he said. "Now the real ones are awake." The clouds above twisted unnaturally. The first tremor of a new warp storm rolled silently across the horizon. The air thickened with ozone, incense, and something that tasted faintly like old blood. Far beyond sight, beyond reason, beyond safety, ancient gods stirred on their horrible thrones. And as the first whisper of true chaos brushed the edges of reality, one terrible question began to shape itself in the minds of both hunter and hunted. What happens when monsters realize they are no longer the apex predators? The storm did not come from the sky. It rose from the ground. The first sign was not thunder, but the sudden smell of hot iron and wet rust, a metallic stench that soaked into the air and coated the tongue. The clouds thickened, not darkening, but reddening, as if the sky itself had been wounded and was beginning to bleed. The ash underfoot lifted without wind, spiraling upward in slow, deliberate columns. The Inquisition's cage faltered. The pylons beneath the cathedral screamed, their ancient machine spirits howling in binary hysteria as new alien pressure crushed against their rituals of denial. The lattice of light around Alucard flickered, destabilized, twisted. The Ordo Malleus stormtroopers felt it first in their bones. Not fear, challenge. A primal call, vibrating through their marrow like a drumbeat played on the ribs of dead gods. In the warp, the blood god had turned his gaze. The air tore open 100 meters away, splitting not like a rip, but like a wound being forced apart. Reality peeled back, revealing a churning vista of brass skies and endless battlefields, where rivers of gore boiled and mountains of skulls rose like obscene monuments. Then they came. They did not march. They descended. A rain of armored forms slammed into the cracked ground, creating impact craters wreathed in dust and steam. Massive figures rose from those craters, their armor thick and brutal, etched with sigils of rage and endless war. Chain axes roared to life. Brass collars hissed with vented steam. Their eyes burned with a singular holy purpose. Khorne's champions had arrived. The lead warrior stepped forward, towering, crowned with horned helm and carrying a gore-slicked axe that hummed with restrained slaughter. His voice, when he roared, shook the air itself. Blood for the blood god. The response from his warriors was deafening. Skulls for the skull throne. The Sisters of Battle reacted instantly. Bolters barked, flamers roared. Hymns rose to meet the war cries. For a heartbeat, the battlefield became a storm of red beams, holy fire, and screaming steel. Chaos warriors fell, torn apart by mass reactive rounds that detonated inside them, blasting corrupted flesh outward in showers of blackened gore. They kept coming. It was never about survival. It was never about victory. It was about the offering. Alucard stood within the failing cage, watching. He felt it, the raw presence pushing against reality like a clenched fist. Not a whisper, not an observer, a god who ruled through slaughter. His lips curved slowly. At last, the cage shattered, not in an explosion, but in surrender. The pylons beneath the stone burned out in a cascade of sacred sparks. The wards collapsed into drifting fragments of scripture light. The pressure vanished. He stepped forward as if the prison had never existed. One of Khorne's champions noticed him. The warrior turned, visor lenses locking onto the lone, red-eyed figure amid the chaos. The chain axe revved higher, teeth screaming. He charged. The ground buckled under the impact of his stride. Alucard did not move. The chain axe bit into his chest. Steel teeth tore. Pistons shrieked. Sparks erupted. The warrior leaned in, roaring wordless devotion as he tried to saw the intruder in half. Alucard looked down at the weapon, then back up at the warrior. No anger, no fear, only interest. His hand closed around the spinning teeth. The chain axe stopped. The warrior froze. For the first time in centuries, he felt uncertainty crawl up his spine like a living thing. Alucard pulled the weapon from his own chest and drove it upward. Not into the warrior's body, but through his helmet, through his skull, through the hatred that had animated him. The chain axe drank its wielder in a scream of confused metal. Blood erupted in a violent halo. Alucard tilted his head back and let the blood wash over his face, eyes half-lidded, savouring not the taste, but the echo. This was not human blood. This was devotion turned into liquid. More champions turned toward him. They did not hesitate. They rushed him. Blades fell, axes roared, fists wreathed in chain and brass swung with enough force to crack tanks. They tore him apart again and again, scattering him into ribbons of shadow and smoking flesh. He reformed inside them, not behind, not above, inside. Shadows burst outward from his form, piercing through armor plates, ripping free corrupted organs, draining every drop of blood into a swirling, screaming vortex that fed back into him. The champion staggered, slowed, confused by a predator that did not obey the laws of slaughter. High above, in a realm of never-ending war, a throne of skulls trembled. Khorne felt it, not as fear, as irritation. A fragment of divine attention pressed down upon the battlefield. The air thickened. Gravity wavered. The ground split, revealing a glimpse of brass and blood beneath the surface of reality. Alucard felt it too. A presence vast beyond measurement. A god looking directly at him. He lifted his gaze into the red sky. "Is that all?" he asked softly. "You send your children to feed me, but you do not come yourself." The world shook. A roar answered, not in sound, but in pure conceptual fury. The clouds twisted into the shape of a colossal, horned visage, formed from storm and rage and endless war. It did not speak. It did not need to. Its message was violence. A titanic force slammed down toward Alucard, the pressure of it cracking the ground, blasting away sororitas and heretics alike. The champions threw themselves to their knees in worship as the divine presence descended. Alucard stood alone against it. His coat whipped in a wind that did not exist. His smile widened, slow and genuine. "Good," he whispered. The air ignited. Reality screamed. And as the first true touch of a chaos god fell towards him like the fist of a universe built on battle, one impossible, heretical question hung in the burning air. What happens when a god of war meets something that does not believe in gods at all? The Uda did not kill him. The divine pressure of Khorne's fury struck like a collapsing star, folding the battlefield inward upon itself. The impact zone became a crater of molten stone and atomized bone, a perfect black wound in the surface of the world. Sororitas' armor melted into the ground. Heretics were smeared into the glassed earth. Even Khorne's champions were torn apart, their armor ripped open like offerings flung before a throne. At the center of that devastation, nothing remained. For a heartbeat. Then the ash began to move, not blown by wind, not stirred by heat. It crawled inward, drawn to a single point, forming a spiral of black dust and drifting fragments. The spiral thickened, condensed, became liquid. The liquid darkened, deepened, and then rose. Alucard reformed. He stood naked for a moment, flesh knitting itself into being, bones aligning with soft, wet sounds. His coat flowed back around him like a curtain of shadow remembering its purpose. The last scorch marks vanished from his skin. He flexed his fingers. He had felt it, the god's touch, not pain, approval. A scent began to creep through the air. It was not the sharpness of iron or the heat of promethium. It was thick, sweet, and heavy, like meat left too long in a closed room, like flowers blooming from a mass grave. The sky changed. The iron clouds softened into something pale and swollen, distended with a sickly, jaundiced light. Ash turned damp, clinging to the ground in slow, wet clumps. The cracked battlefield began to soften, stone rotting into loam, broken metal sprouting tendrils of rust that curled like living vines. The world was becoming a garden. From the air, a laugh rolled through existence. It was warm. It was affectionate. It was swollen with love so vast it was almost suffocating. Nurgle had begun to notice. The ground beneath Alucard's boots turned spongy, sinking slightly with each step. Pale mushrooms burst from unseen spores, growing to towering heights in seconds, their caps dripping viscous, luminous slime. Trees of bone and rotting meat twisted up from the soil, their bark splitting to reveal pulsing, weeping interiors. The air filled with flies, not small ones, cathedral-sized clouds of buzzing, crawling, biting life. They circled him without landing, unsure whether he was food or something far worse. From the growing forest, shapes emerged, plague-bearers, tall, hunched things with single weeping eyes and rusted blades fused to their hands. Their flesh hung off their bones in wet, sloughing folds. Each step left trails of green-black corruption in the soil, and behind them came something vast. A great unclean one pushed through the decaying trees, its bulk tearing rot and pus from living trunks. Its massive, swollen body was a map of sores and open wounds, all of them smiling. It leaned forward, voice bubbling out like a cauldron of warm disease. "Oh, sweet anomaly," it gurgled. "You have wandered far from any proper sickness." Alucard looked at the creature. He felt the rot touching him, not biting, not burning, inviting. His skin dimmed slightly. A faint pallor spread for the briefest moment, as if rot was trying to learn his shape. He laughed softly. "You offer eternity through decay," he said, "but I do not decay." The great unclean one swayed, chuckling. "All things rot," it replied. "Even stars, even gods. Come, let grandfather show you how gentle it can be." The garden surged toward him. Vines wrapped around his wrists, soft and wet, trying to sink spores into his flesh. Mushrooms burst against his coat in clouds of choking, sweet-smelling dust. The air thickened with invisible sickness, viruses so ancient they had names only in extinct prayers. He let it touch him, let it try. The rot entered him, and died, not burned, not rejected, simply ended. The vines withered where they touched his skin, collapsing into dry, dead threads. The spores fell inert in the air, dropping like lifeless dust. The flies veered away suddenly, their swarm breaking apart in confused spirals. The great unclean one frowned. It tried again. A wave of green-black filth surged forward, a tidal flood of living plague aimed directly at Alucard's heart. It struck him fully, coating him in layers of laughing pus and screaming rot. Silence fell. Then the filth began to move backward. It was not pushed, it was pulled. The disease flowed back into him, not infecting, but being eaten. The rot was stripped of its purpose, its spirit, its gift. It vanished into his shadow, leaving nothing behind. The great unclean one took a step back. That had never happened. In a realm beyond decay, a garden the size of constellations trembled. ancient, jovial eyes blinked slowly. The sensation was unfamiliar. Loss, not of power, of something worse, relevance. The ground beneath Alucard began to crack again, the garden peeling away, the rot retreating as if the world itself rejected the gift it had almost accepted. The trees of flesh sank back into dirt. The mushrooms collapsed into foul-smelling sludge. The air dried. The flies fled. The great unclean one lingered for a moment longer, then bowed its massive head slightly. "You are rude," it gurgled. "Grandfather does not like rude things." It melted backwards into the rotting trees, which vanished after it, leaving only broken cathedrals and ashen earth behind. Silence returned, but it was not empty. Far away, in a palace of silk and sensation, a different kind of attention began to stir. Where Khorne had offered violence and Nurgle had offered comfort, something else was becoming curious. Something that whispered rather than roared. Something that tempted rather than crushed. Alucard looked into the slowly clearing sky. He felt it. A new presence, delicate and terrible, sliding along the edges of his mind like a caress sharpened to a razor. His smile returned, thin and knowing. "If rot cannot claim me," he murmured, stepping forward through the last remnants of decay, "I wonder what pleasure will try." Behind him, the last traces of Nurgle's garden burned away into nothing, leaving only the smell of old sweetness and a single, unanswered thought hanging in the air. What kind of corruption do you offer to something that cannot rot? The silence after rot was not empty. It was listening. The air changed again, not with heat or decay, but with a subtle pressure that felt like fingertips brushing across the edges of thought. The sky softened from iron to a bruised violet, streaked with slow-moving bands of gold and deep, impossible black. The wind did not smell of blood or rot. It smelled of promise. The ruined battlefield shifted, stones smoothed, cracks flattened. Broken statues straightened themselves, their shattered features becoming strangely symmetrical, almost beautiful in their ruin. The ground was no longer ash, but cold, polished obsidian that reflected a distorted version of the sky. Every reflection felt slightly wrong, as if it was smiling when no smile had been made. Alucard walked forward, each step making no sound. He felt it. This was not an assault. It was an invitation. From the horizon, a city rose. Not built, but grown, like a sculptor's dream, drawn straight from nightmare and desire. Towers curved instead of standing straight. Bridges twisted in graceful, impossible arcs. Every surface glimmered with faint, shifting colors that danced just at the edge of perception. Silent figures moved through those streets, not quite human, too perfect in form, too fluid in motion. Their eyes caught the light and reflected it back in strange, almost hypnotic patterns. They did not charge. They did not threaten. They watched. In the warp, Slaanesh became aware. Not with hunger, with interest. A presence brushed against Alucard's mind, not like a blow, but like velvet gloves across sharpened steel. It carried no words, only impressions. Visions surfaced without warning. A throne of black stone in a ruined London drenched in endless night. A world where blood flowed freely beneath a red moon. Wars fought alone against men who thought themselves monsters and learned too late they were only prey. Familiar battlefields, familiar silences, old victories. "And still," whispered a voice without sound, "you are empty." Alucard stopped walking. The city folded inward, streets bending around him. Architecture shifting until he stood at the center of a vast hall carved from smooth, reflective crystal. Every surface reflected him. Thousands of versions of the same predator staring back. Some smiled wider, some looked older, some looked tired. None looked fulfilled. The air filled with soft, overlapping sounds, not music, but the suggestion of music. Rhythms that stimulated memory, suggestion, longing. The temperature changed in faint waves, growing warmer, cooler, stirring sensations he had long ago buried beneath centuries of battle. The presence grew stronger. "Would you like to feel?" it asked. Not pain, not hunger. Something deeper, something perfect. He felt it try to slide inside him, not with force, with consent. It conjured visions of endless feasts of sensation, of wars not fought for necessity but pleasure, of power so overwhelming that even boredom would cease to exist. It showed him himself, crowned, not as a king, not as a god, but as something adored by the galaxy simply for what he was. "Stay," the voice coaxed. "Walk the pathways of perfection. Let the war end. Let the hunt become art." The reflections around him began to move. They stepped closer, stepping out of their mirrored prisons, surrounding him in a slow, circling dance. They did not touch him. They did not threaten him. They offered him himself, refined, elevated, worshipped. Alucard felt the weight of it, not temptation, understanding. This god did not want to break him. It wanted to complete him. He laughed quietly. The sound was soft, but it shattered the perfect rhythm in the air. The reflections froze. The presence hesitated. "You misunderstand," Alucard said, his voice echoing cleanly through the crystal hall. "I am not empty because I lack sensation." The floor beneath him rippled slightly. "I am empty," he continued, stepping forward, "because I devoured everything that ever tried to fill me." The temperature dropped. The air sharpened. One of the reflected versions of himself reached for him. Its hand passed through empty air. He reached back. His shadow rose beneath the reflection and swallowed it whole, the mirror self collapsing into screaming blackness before dissolving into nothing. The presence recoiled slightly. It tried again. Now the visions were more subtle, less known, less familiar, showed him futures instead of pasts, a galaxy crumbling at his feet, empires kneeling, even the chaos gods broken, bleeding, screaming. "You could be adored," it whispered. "You could be desired." Alucard stepped toward the heart of the hall. With every step, the crystal around him cracked. Hairline fractures spread like spiderwebs across perfection. "I do not desire to be worshipped," he said calmly. "I desire to know what happens when worship fails." The hall trembled. The mirrored cells dissolved into jagged shards that floated in the air like frozen tears of glass. The city outside began to warp, its graceful towers bending into broken, ugly angles. The presence pulled back further. This was not going as designed. This thing did not crave perfection. It devoured it. Far away, within a palace of silk, perfume, and shrieking ecstasy, something beautiful paused mid-indulgence. A perfect face slowly turned toward the disturbance with mild irritation. Not anger, not fear, confusion. On the battlefield turned mirage, the last of the polished surfaces darkened, turning matte, then cracked, then flaked away to reveal scorched stone and ruined cathedral foundations beneath. The air lost its warmth. The suggestion of music died. The voice withdrew fully. But before it vanished, it left one final whisper in his thoughts. "You are not bored," it said. "You are unfinished." Alucard stood alone again in the ruin, the sky shifting slowly back toward iron and violet. He looked down at his gloved hand and flexed his fingers once. "Perhaps," he murmured. Above, the clouds twisted more violently than before. Warp lightning flickered soundlessly in the upper atmosphere, painting the broken world in silent flashes of blue, red, and sickly gold. The Imperium was no longer merely aware, it was adjusting. A new kind of attention slid into place, sharper, colder, more deliberate. A presence that did not tempt, a presence that planned. Alucard lifted his gaze toward the storming heavens. Tzeentch, he said softly, tasting the name without ever hearing it. The wind rose, sudden and unnatural, whipping ash and broken banners across the dead land as reality itself began to feel less like stone and more like a question. And as the first true threads of fate began to twist around him, a final quiet thought hung in the air, unanswered and unnerving. What kind of maze could possibly hold something that walks through gods? The storm did not break. It rewrote itself. The sky became a shifting manuscript of colour and fracture. Every cloud an unfinished sentence. Every flash of silent lightning a punctuation mark in a language never meant for mortal thought. Ash rose, fell, rose again, moving not by wind but by design, forming slow, deliberate spirals that twisted around Alucard without touching him. The ground was no longer ground. With a single step, it became black marble. With the next, scorched earth. With the next, a field of ancient bones arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Reality flickered like a page being turned too quickly. He understood, without being told. This was not domination. This was architecture. Tzeentch did not strike. It built. The world folded inward and outward at the same time. Ruined cathedrals became libraries of floating stone tablets covered in burning script. Craters became vast, spiraling staircases that descended into nothing and ascended into false skies. Every structure existed only to lead somewhere else, and every path promised a destination that moved as it was approached. Alucard walked forward anyway. The air vibrated with distant, overlapping whispers, not voices, possibilities, futures that never happened sliding past those that almost did. 1,000 versions of the galaxy drifted like ghosts just beneath the surface of the present. "You are late," a voice said from everywhere and nowhere. He stopped. The voice was calm, amused, patient. A shape gathered in front of him, not stepping into existence but assembling from fractured potential. A tall, thin form, cloaked in robes of shifting colour, its head a silhouette that refused to resolve into a single shape. Where eyes should have been, there were small, rotating stars. "Tzeentch," Alucard said, unbothered. The thing inclined its impossible head. "A name is a tool," it replied. "Not all tools are safe in your hands." The labyrinth expanded around them. Walls of crystal grew and collapsed, revealing vistas of impossible futures. He saw terror burning. He saw the golden throne empty. He saw chaos devouring itself. He saw himself standing alone in a galaxy of blackened stars. "You do not belong to any path," the presence continued. "That offends the pattern." Alucard walked closer. The floor beneath him became a mosaic of moving futures, each one a tile of might have been. He saw himself kneeling before Khorne, rotting joyfully in Nurgle's garden, smiling amidst Slaaneish's endless revels. He stepped past them as if they were dust. "You think I am missing something," he said, "that I am an error in your design." The air cooled. The labyrinth tightened. Flame-coloured runes ignited along shifting walls, each one a sigil of binding, of fate, of inevitable outcome. The air tasted of ozone and old parchment. "You are," Tzeentch admitted, "which makes you valuable." Suddenly, the maze changed. No more decay, no more ruin. It transformed into a grand, impossible library stretching beyond sight. Shelves stacked with burning books, floating scrolls, chains of crystal inscribed with screaming living text. Each tome radiated psychic pressure, the weight of truths too dangerous to remember. One floated toward him. It opened. Inside was his story. Not as it had been, as it would be. He saw himself devouring a world. He saw himself becoming a god among corpses. He saw himself alone at the end of time, staring at a dead, silent universe that had nothing left to offer him. Every predator reaches an end, the voice said. Every story ends in exhaustion. The book tried to burn itself into his mind. He closed it with one hand. The pages disintegrated into ash. "You mistake me," he replied softly, "for a man with a future." The books began to shake, shelves twisted. The air fractured into angular planes of light and darkness. Tzeentch stepped closer, its form flickering, losing coherence as if irritated by something it could not correct. "You walk between outcomes," it said. "You consume what should happen. You erase design." Alucard's shadow lengthened, crawling across the crystal floor, wrapping around shelves, coiling through floating runes. Wherever it touched, text went blank. Where it passed, burned letters fell silent. "You cannot control me," Alucard said, "not because I resist." He looked directly at the shifting, scheming presence, "but because I do not participate." The labyrinth cracked, not shattered. Cracked. The sound was not loud. It was catastrophic. Hairline fractures spread through the entire constructed reality, splitting futures from possibilities, severing paths before they could be walked. The floating books burst into soulless light. The scrolls curled and burned without flame. Tzeentch recoiled, not in fear, in calculation. The presence thinned, unraveling slightly, retreating into layers of design and denial and endless contingency. "This is not over," it said. "Nothing ever is." Alucard smiled. "I hope not." The library folded in on itself, collapsing like a thought abandoned mid-sentence. The sky returned, storming, torn, threaded with bolts of silent insanity. The shattered battlefield returned beneath his boots, its broken cathedrals once more anchored in ruin and war. But now, the warp no longer whispered. It screamed. Far away, across the Imperium, constellations of madness shifted. Plans long in motion were rewritten. Contingencies failed before being enacted. Fate stuttered like a broken machine spirit. In places where destiny had always been certain, it began to bleed. Alucard felt it, the attention of gods. Not curious now, not amused, alert. They had tested, they had offered, they had planned, and none of it had worked. Above the iron-stained clouds, the warp boiled like an ocean brought to a sudden, violent boil. Storms began to gather that were not meant for worlds, but for realities. Alucard looked upward, eyes burning like coals buried in fresh blood. "You understand now," he murmured. The sky flickered with broken color as the first true tremor of divine unease took hold of the Imperium. And in the heart of the storm, where fate and madness tore at one another like starving beasts, a terrifying question began to take shape. What does a god of schemes do when something exists beyond every plan? The warp broke its own boundaries first. The sky above the dead world did not tear open like a wound. It peeled apart like skin pulled free from muscle, revealing the raw, screaming anatomy of the Imperium beneath. Color spilled downward in vertical rivers. Sound lost meaning and came back twisted. The ground trembled, not from impact, but from proximity to something that should never touch reality. Alucard did not step back. He stepped forward. The air tasted of ozone, blood, rot, and 1,000 other flavors of madness as the barrier thinned further. Through the widening breach, shapes moved that had never worn form and had never needed to. Titans of impossible geometry, choirs of screaming mouths, serpentine storms of claws and wings and eyes. Not lesser demons, not servants, fragments of God. The first thing that reached through was not a creature. It was a concept. Violence given mass. A massive horned silhouette descended, wrought from brass, fire, and coagulated wrath. Its presence boiled the air. The ground liquefied beneath it. Invisible pressure crushed everything for kilometers in every direction. A shard of corn. Its arrival was not announced. It was felt. Alucard felt it like a hand placed upon the back of his mind. He welcomed it. The entity raised a weapon formed from solidified battle scream, and the world split along the arc of its swing. Reality caved in where the blow passed, collapsing into howling nothingness. Alucard walked through it. The blade struck him. For the first time, it did not simply pass through. It cut. His torso split open, flesh unraveling, bones cracking, shadows scattering like torn cloth in a storm. He did not scream. He lunged. His hand closed around the entity's arm, not gripping flesh, but gripping idea. Violence recoiled, confused by being touched rather than worshipped. Alucard dragged it close, his mouth opening wider than human structure allowed. He bit into it. There was no blood. There was no meat. There was war. He consumed a fragment of endless slaughter, swallowing it into himself. The entity convulsed, its massive form flickering, destabilizing as part of it simply ceased to exist. The skies deepened in color. A second presence pushed through. This one was wet, swollen. It arrived with the smell of sweet rot and the sound of distant, joyful wheezing. The air blistered. The ground sprouted pustules. The breach expanded as a vast, corpulent shadow leaned through, its form laughing silently. A shard of Nurgle. Tendrils of living corruption lashed out, wrapping around Alucard's arms, his legs, his torso. They pressed into him, trying to seed eternity's slow decay. He did not resist. He opened himself. The rot surged in and was eaten. It poured into the hollow places inside him and vanished. The surrounding air clarified. The pustules burst and dried. The tendrils shriveled to blackened husks. The entity staggered. Then another presence, silk and glass, sensation and scream. A shard of Slaanesh slipped through the tearing veil, its form too beautiful, too perfect, and too wrong to be held by ordinary senses. The air sang with it. The colors of the world sharpened. Every surface grew painfully smooth. It reached for him, not with claws, with invitation. It did not speak. It showed him ecstasy enough to crack planets, pleasure that erased identity, worship that turned pain into joy. He did not hesitate. He walked into it. He wrapped his arms around the presence. He devoured it. Its perfect form cracked as if struck by a hammer. Fractures of silent sound spread through it as its essence poured into him and vanished. The air fell dull. The colors bled away. The last to emerge moved differently, quiet, clever. It did not manifest fully, only parting the veil enough for a tall, shadowed outline to observe. Tzeentch's fragment did not attack. It watched. It studied. It mapped. Alucard felt that gaze and looked directly into it. It did not retreat. It calculated. The breach widened further. Dozens of lesser reflections of the gods pressed against the membrane of reality, eager now, hungry now, no longer curious, but furious. They began to pour through. and Alucard began to hunt. He stepped into the open wound in the sky itself, using its torn edges as purchase, climbing into the weakened Imperium like a predator stepping into its prey's womb. Every demon that rushed him was torn apart and consumed. Every shard of divine will that touched him was bitten, shredded, and swallowed. The warp began to scream in earnest, not in pleasure, in pain. Far away, impossible thrones shook. Mountains of skulls cracked. Gardens of rot sagged unnaturally. Palaces of perfection trembled. The gods felt something they were never meant to feel. Consumption. Back on the ruined world, the breach widened until the sky was no longer sky, but a vertical sea of shrieking color and impossible depth. Alucard's silhouette was visible within it, moving like a slow, methodical storm. He was no longer simply drinking blood. He was drinking myth. He was no longer hunting monsters. He was hunting ideas that wore crowns. The last thing the world heard was not thunder, but a sound like reality drawing in a terrified breath. And somewhere, deep within the warp, the first truly unthinkable fear began to spread. What happens if something can eat what was never supposed to die? The first god did not die with a scream. It died with a silence so absolute that the warp itself recoiled. Across the Imperium, where madness had once flowed in endless roaring tides, pauses began to appear. Not calm, not peace, absence. Pockets where screams ceased mid-breath, where rage lost its echo, where rot stopped laughing. On the ruined world below, the sky was no longer sky. It had become a wound that refused to close, a vast vertical ocean of color, claw, fire, and shattered prayer. Within it, Alucard moved like a hunting shadow, drifting deeper, further, feeding. He did not consume like a beast. He consumed like a void. A fragment of corn fractured in his grasp, its essence tearing away not as blood, but as the memory of steel striking bone. He pulled it into himself. It did not nourish him. It did not empower him. It ended. A lesser god screaming would have drawn attention. This drew dread. Far beyond the battlefield, in the deepest reaches of the warp, the throne of skulls cracked. Rows of ancient fused bones split apart as fault lines of fear spidered through what had once been the absolute seat of rage. Khorne did not feel pain. He felt interruption. He felt denial. A river of blood stalled in mid-flow, hanging in the air like a suspended thought before shattering into lifeless droplets. In the Garden of Decay, vines of infinite rot began to wither. The laughter of flies stuttered. Grandfather's soothing hum faltered for the first time since before time. Whole fields of blessed corruption turned brittle, shedding rusted leaves like dying memories. An ancient bell of comfort cracked with a dull, hollow sound. Nurgle's joy trembled. In palaces of silk and shrieking ecstasy, musicians faltered, their strings snapping mid-note. Dancers froze, their perfect form suddenly uncertain. Mirrors, once flawless, reflected nothing for brief, horrifying instants. Slanesh's realm felt empty, and in the shifting spires of impossible intelligence, threads of fate began to tangle. Visions blurred, schemes reached for outcomes that no longer logically existed. Tzeentch felt plans dissolving before they were enacted. The Changer of Ways tasted something utterly alien. Unpredictability. Within the wound in the sky, Alucard felt it all. The tremors, the faltering, the dawning realization of things that had never imagined themselves hunted. He dragged himself deeper into the Imperium, stepping over writhing demons that begged, threatened, and dissolved beneath him. Their forms collapsed into ash before he could even taste them. They were no longer relevant. He was past them. He reached a place where sound could no longer function. Not silence. A void where even silence would have noise. Here, a massive presence coalesced before him. Not a shard, not a fragment, a true aspect. A towering manifestation of rage and identity, burning with eons of unchallenged existence. Khorne's will, given shape. It did not speak. It did not threaten. It expanded. Space collapsed under its presence. Meaning bent. The very idea of Alucard flickered for a moment under the pressure of something that had defined war since before stars learned to burn. For a fraction of a heartbeat, even he was tested. Then he laughed. The sound did not travel. It simply existed. He stepped forward and placed one hand against the immense presence. The contact was not physical. It was categorical. One concept touching another. He opened his mouth and ate. The effect was not explosive. It was surgical. A section of the entity vanished, not torn away, not fragmented, simply removed from the structure of reality. The remaining form convulsed, trying to reassert itself, trying to draw power from a throne that trembled and a realm that had begun to forget what it stood for. Too late. The second bite took a larger part. The third was a mercy. The manifestation collapsed inward, folding into a point of no return before vanishing entirely. No scream, no echo, no final war cry. Just absence. The warp recoiled violently. Storms flared across realities. Empyrean tides surged and stalled. Vast tracts of demonic territories turned dormant, their rulers suddenly unreachable, unresponsive, unremembered. On the ruined world, the sky began to distort alarmingly. The breach wavered, light bending in upon itself as if the universe was struggling to accept a state of existence where a god had simply stopped being interaction capable. Below, forgotten sensors screamed out corrupted data, to no one left alive to hear them. In Inquisition vessels, screens filled with static and impossible readings. In the void around Terra, astropaths fell to their knees, clutching their skulls as distant, unfamiliar silences rippled through their connection to madness. Back in the warp, Alucard drifted. He felt it. The first true silence of a screaming god. It did not satisfy him. It did not thrill him. It interested him. He turned, already sensing the next presence quivering behind thin layers of frantic reality. Others were retreating. Others were consolidating. Others were trying to understand how a constant of their existence had been rewritten. His shadow stretched out, further into the storm. Behind him, where a god's will had once existed, there was now nothing at all. A blind spot in eternity, a scar in a realm that was never meant to know scars. The sky wound above the world, writhed, struggling to close, struggling to forget. It failed. The wound remained. And in the hearts of the remaining powers of the warp, a single horrifying realization began to spread. One of them was no longer answering, and the thing responsible was not slowing down. As reality strained and unseen dominions began to shift farther away from a predator they could no longer ignore, a final, dreadful question began to echo through both heaven and hell alike. If one god can fall into silence, how many more will follow? The first scream did not come from the warp. It came from a mind that could no longer comprehend what it was sensing. On Terra, beneath miles of rockcrete, sacred stone, and shrines layered atop shrines, an astropath's eyes burst into ash. He had been listening to the Imperium when the familiar roar went silent. Centuries of trained suffering had prepared him for madness, for pain, for the howling chorus of demons. Nothing had prepared him for quiet. His mouth opened in a soundless plea as his mind tried to grasp an emptiness that was not meant to exist. Around him, Others staggered, their psychic hoods crackling, their robes catching fire as their thoughts recoiled from the absence spreading through their shared trance. The scream echoed outward through the Imperium. Navigators felt it in their third eyes. The Astronomican's guiding light flickered, not as though it were weakening, but as though something beyond it was disrupting the very idea of guidance. Warp routes trembled. Stable passages folded into uncertain currents. Entire trade lanes vanished from charts written in flesh and prayer. In 1,000 cathedral fortresses, priests faltered mid-sermon, tongues thickening as the familiar, distant background scream of chaos stuttered. The silence was not relief, it was terror. On 100 warfronts, demons hesitated. Some vanished. Others froze mid-slaughter, their claws stuck halfway through ceramite and bone, as if they had forgotten what their purpose was. Cultists found their prayers unanswered. Their idols soured into inert, worthless shapes of stone and metal. The sky wound above the dead world remained open. Inside it, Alucard drifted closer to the surface of reality once more. Not in retreat, but in awareness. He felt the ripples spreading outward, not shockwaves. Ripples of existential doubt, carried through dimensions by the medium of disbelief. The galaxy had noticed, not him, the absence behind him. Behind his shadow lay a place where a god's will no longer existed. The warp struggled to flow through that region, curving around it like a river avoiding a hole in the world. He emerged partially from the wound, boots touching the air above the ruined planet. Half of his form still coiled in, impossible color. Below him, the battlefield lay dead and glassed. Above him, the sky writhed. Across the stars, responses began. In the segmentum solar, an inquisitorial command chamber fell into emergency breach protocols. Hololithic projections flickered, showing warp storm formations that made no sense, blind spots where astropathic messages simply ceased to exist. Inquisitor Malric watched the data with a face carved from cold stone. A gap, he whispered. Not a storm, not interference. A gap. His attendants shifted uneasily. You cannot have a gap in the warp, one said. Malric did not answer. He already knew. In a fortress monastery orbiting a dying star, space marines of a dozen chapters felt something like instinct flicker through gene-wrought hearts. Chaplains fell silent mid-litany. Even dreadnoughts, entombed in walking sarcophagi of iron, felt disturbance in their half-dreaming minds. Something old was afraid. Across the eye of terror, the storm began to churn irregularly, not stronger, not weaker, erratic. Currents folded in ways that did not follow emotion, death, or belief. Vast regions dimmed, others flared wildly. The warp did not feel alive, it felt injured. Alucard hovered between two realities and watched the consequences of a single consumption spread like a disease that infected gods instead of men. He felt the remaining attention, not playful, not curious, focused. From the immeasurable depths of the immaterium, the other great presences pulled inward, consolidating, tightening their realms, erecting impossible barriers of will and belief. Domains that had once expanded now contracted like wounded beasts circling an unfamiliar predator. Something else began to move. On the golden throne, the rotting emperor's psychic scream twisted. For the first time in 10,000 years, the scream changed tone. Not agony, recognition. The corpse emperor felt the silence too. Through layers of machine and bone and sacrifice, his withered consciousness brushed against the absence spreading in the warp. He did not see Alucard. He felt a shape like him, and remembered older things. In the wound above the world, Alucard tilted his head, as if hearing something far away and faintly familiar. A pressure brushed the edges of his awareness. Not a god, not a demon. Something broken, something furious. Something that had once been a man and a god, and was now neither. He smiled faintly. "Interesting," he murmured. The galaxy continued to react. Emergency edicts screamed across Vox networks. Inquisitorial kill orders were drafted against threats that had no names. The Ordo Malleus declared doctrines of absolute silence regarding anomalous immaterial voids. They called it impossible. They called it heresy. Quietly, in chambers never meant to hear fear, they called it the beginning of something they could not fight. The dead world below him cracked, finally unable to endure the strain of hosting a wound in reality. The planet's crust groaned, tectonic plates shifting violently as if trying to shake off a parasite embedded in the sky above. Alucard began to descend fully back into real space, the wound unwilling to close behind him, writhing as it struggled to seal a scar in infinity. Behind him, the warp convulsed. Ahead of him, a galaxy trembled, and in the black, poisonous air, hanging over a world that had just become the center of a cosmic impossibility, one terrible thought began to take root in the hearts of men, monsters, and gods alike. If one god can vanish, what monster walks among us now? The wound in the sky did not close. It widened. Reality strained like stretched flesh, threads of air tearing at the edges where the Imperium pressed its screaming, wounded face against the material world. The dead planet below shuddered, its cratered surface fracturing further, oceans buried beneath its crust spasming as seismic waves rolled endlessly through its hollow bones. Alucard descended, not falling, not flying. He simply chose to be lower, and so he was. The ash wind wrapped around his coat as his boots touched broken stone once more. The ground did not welcome him. It feared him. Dust crawled away from his footsteps. Fractured ruins trembled as he passed, as though the world remembered something terrible had touched it and wished to forget. Above him, the wound writhed. Below him, the shattered carcass of a planet held its breath. He felt it again. Not chaos, not rot, not rage. The pressure of a vast, distant presence that had learned a new shape of terror. The Emperor. On Terra, the golden throne screamed silently, cables quivering like exposed nerves. The mountain of machinery and sacrifice quaked in tiny, frantic movements that no one dared to acknowledge. Within the rotting shell of a god, a mind burned with a light so old it predated his own empire. The corpse emperor sensed the void. He sensed a hunger that did not echo in the warp. He sensed a presence that had eaten what even he had been forced to endure. He did not speak. He could not. He pushed. A psychic ripple, ancient and raw, surged outward from Terra, travelling along forgotten, half-broken pathways through the Imperium, not as a roar, but as a demand. Who are you? The question reached the dead world, like the faintest echo of thunder from the beginning of time. Alucard felt it brush the edges of his awareness. He tilted his head, listening. A faint smile touched his lips. "A throne that screams," he murmured. "How appropriate." The warp above thickened. The wound began to stabilize, but not in healing, in purpose. Within the tear in reality, something began to form. Not Khorne, not Nurgle, not Slanesh, not Tzeentch. Something new, or something emptied. The Imperium warped itself into a shape, drawn not from emotion or worship, but from predation. The fabric of madness tightened, twisted, and condensed, building a structure from raw, terrified disorder. A throne. It was not built of skulls, not grown from bone, not woven from silk or rot. It was a throne of absence, of where gods used to be, of broken prayers that had nowhere to go. Alucard felt its call, a pull, not sweet, not seductive, inevitable. He stepped toward the wound. The air resisted. Reality screamed. He stepped anyway. His form crossed the boundary fully, walking out of the world and into the half-born structure forming within the Empyrean tear. The throne stretched before him, vast and black, carved from something that no longer existed. Behind it, the remnants of a godless abyss writhed. This was not Khorne's realm, not any gods. This was the aftermath of godhood. He approached the seat. For the first time since his arrival, his steps slowed. Not from fear, from hesitation. He felt the truth of it. If he sat upon that throne, the warp would change around him. Not as a servant, not as a slave, as a replacement, not a god, a principle, consumption made eternal. The galaxy would not worship, it would endure, or starve. Visions flickered through his thoughts uninvited. A warp without gods, but with him. A galaxy where demons trembled, where faith collapsed, where the Emperor's scream faded into irrelevant static. An Imperium alone in the dark, with something worse than chaos watching it forever. His fingers twitched. He felt another pull, from behind. The material universe, the broken planet, the silent watching stars. He remembered what he had been before thrones and wounds and gods. A ghost, a hunter, a thing that walked through eternity without ruling it, a shadow untouched by worship. The throne pulsed, waiting. The Imperium trembled, offering him what no being had ever reached, a seat not built for devotion, but for devouring. He stepped closer, then stopped. "I do not sit," he said quietly. The response was immediate. The throne resisted. Reality inside the wound strained, trying to press him forward, to lock him into position, to make him what the warp now needed to survive. He laughed and stepped back. The throne cracked. Not shattered, cracked. A fissure ran through the seat, splitting it slightly, leaking fragments of divinity that evaporated before they could exist. Behind him, the wound in the sky began to destabilize again, not from collapse, but from refusal. He turned away from the throne. He walked back toward reality. The warp howled, not in rage, but in confusion. It had built something that refused to be used. Below, the dead world shuddered as he crossed the boundary once more, boots striking stone. The sky wound writhed violently above him, unable to close, unable to complete its offering. Far away, Terra felt it. The Emperor felt it. Something had been offered godhood, and had declined. The horror of that knowledge spread through the psychic veins of the Imperium. Alucard looked back once, at the broken, half-formed throne writhing in the wounded sky. "Not yet," he whispered. The sky split with silent, warp lightning. The wind rose, the ash spun, and as the wound continued to twist above a galaxy that had just witnessed defiance greater than worship, one final terrible question began to form in the minds of gods, men, and monsters alike. If he refused the throne, what could possibly stop him from taking everything instead? The wound never closed. It remained in the sky above the dead world, a vertical scar of impossible color and silent fury, twisting slowly like a memory the universe could not forget. The planet beneath it had stopped trying to resist. Its crust lay broken, its bones exposed, its surface frozen in permanent expectation. Alucard stood alone. The ash had settled. The wind had stilled. Even the warp seemed to hesitate. Far away, Terra burned in quiet terror. The Golden Throne's cables writhed against their restraints, thick as serpents and older than empires. The The withered emperor's consciousness flickered within the machinery, stretched thin across 10,000 years of agony and sacrifice. He felt the open wound in the warp like a missing limb, but he felt something worse. Choice. The thing that had devoured a god had refused godhood. That defied even his understanding. The Emperor pushed again, one last time, sending a psychic command across collapsing pathways of the Imperium. You are not of this war. The thought reached Alucard like the brush of a dying star's heat. He laughed softly. All wars are the same, he replied into the empty air. Yours just screams louder. Above him, the wound rippled violently, reacting not to will, but to proximity. The broken throne inside the warp fractured further, its purpose unraveling without an occupant to finalize its birth. The remaining gods hid, not behind armies, not behind demons. They folded their dominions inward, wrapping their realms in layers of denial, secrecy, and desperate eternal vigilance. Their servants felt it, their cults felt it, their demons felt it. They were no longer hunters, they were prey pretending to be vast. Across the galaxy, consequences unfolded. Astropathic choirs went silent as psychers refused to open their minds fully, terrified of touching a region of the warp that no longer howled. Navigators lost their third sight mid-journey, vessels vanishing into darkness where the Astronomicon flickered uselessly. Entire systems slipped off the map of existence, not destroyed, but unreachable. Faith began to crack, not publicly, never publicly, but in small, terrified moments behind locked cathedral doors, where priests whispered to one another that the warp no longer felt alive, that something new stalked the depths, that perhaps the Emperor was no longer the most terrible force watching over mankind. On the dead world, Alucard began to walk, not toward the wound, away from it. Each step pulled the air tighter behind him, as though reality itself feared what might happen if he decided to turn back. The ruins trembled underfoot. Fossilized, prayers carved into stone began to fracture. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Behind him, the wound writhed. It wanted him. It would always want him, but it could not command him. He reached the edge of a vast chasm, where the planet's surface had finally cracked beyond recovery, exposing a bottomless blackness that drank light and sound. He stopped there, looking out over the destruction. He felt the last presence. Not chaos, not warp, not God. Memory. All the battles that had once defined him, all the worlds that had tried to contain him, all the wars that had believed themselves old and terrible. This galaxy was worse. This galaxy was honest. It did not pretend to be anything but a slaughterhouse of belief. It suits me, he murmured. Above him, the wound convulsed violently. The broken throne collapsed in on itself, shattering into fragments of concept and unrealized divinity. Those fragments scattered into the warp, where they dissolved like ash in an endless storm. The warp shrieked, not in anger, in awareness. Something had refused its highest offering. Something had tasted godhood and walked away. Across the Imperium, the remaining gods withdrew further, their realms dimming, their demons whispering new forbidden prayers, not to their masters, but away from the predator. On Terra, the Emperor felt the collapse of the half-born throne. A psychic tremor passed through his broken mind, not pain, not fear, relief and dread. He had survived monsters before, he had endured gods, he had endured eternity. But this was a thing that did not need to rule to destroy. The wind began to rise again, slowly, like a breath before a scream. Alucard turned his gaze upward, toward the wounded sky, toward the invisible armies of the Imperium, toward the flickering light of a throne-bound god far across the galaxy. He lifted a single hand. The wound shuddered, not at his command, at his acknowledgement. "I will not eat everything," he said quietly. Across the warp, everything stilled. Even the gods leaned closer, afraid of the answer. "I will not sit upon your empty throne," he continued, lowering his hand. The dead world trembled. The galaxy held its breath. He smiled, a thin, eternal curve of amusement and promise. "I will simply walk." The wind howled. The wound began, slowly, imperfectly, to close. Not healing, never healing, but receding like a scar sliding beneath skin. The sky regained some of its iron hue. The ash fell silent. Far away, terror trembled once more, not from psychic scream, but from the knowledge that something had touched the edge of divine and rejected it. Alucard stepped forward, away from the chasm, away from the wound, away from the temptation of becoming what the galaxy deserved. He walked toward the unknown, toward the Imperium, toward war zones not yet broken, toward cathedrals not yet silent. Behind him, the warp slowly regained its scream, but it screamed differently now, quieter, wary, as, though it had learned something, it wished it could forget. And across the galaxy, in whispered prayers, broken prophecies, forbidden inquisitorial records, and the nightmares of gods, one eternal, unanswered question remained, echoing through existence like a scar that could never be erased. What becomes of a universe when even its gods can no longer stop what walks within it?